the US is producing more oil than ever. In fact, the US is pumping more oil than any country ever has in the history of the world.
We will drill, baby, drill.
The US is sending away nearly a third of its oil just to get it swapped out with oil from somewhere else. This is the story of America's wild oil revolution and why it still won't give the US energy independence.
This is a chart of the biggest oil producers in the world. And to the surprise of many, the United States is right at the top. In fact, last year alone, the US produced about 21 million barrels of oil every single day. That's almost double what Russia or Saudi Arabia produce individually, and even slightly more than what the US consumes each day. Yet, for decades, we've all been made to believe that the US depends on foreign oil. And strangely enough, that's still kind of true. Even now, after China, the US remains the second largest importer of crude oil globally, buying from about 15 different countries, including Canada, Mexico, Guyana, and Saudi Arabia. These imports, especially ones from Saudi Arabia, may now be at risk because Iran is considering closing the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for US B-2 strikes. Now, I know what you guys are about to say. The US only imports 7% of total oil from Saudis. We don't need to worry about the Strait of Hormuz. Well, this is where I have a surprise for you. You see, the US also exports a huge chunk of its own oil, roughly 4 million barrels every day, and then turns around to buy 6.5 million barrels daily from other countries. So even if a smaller number of tankers are taken off the market in the Strait of Hormuz, the oil price will go up all over the world. Now, that may be good news for US producers, but it's definitely not good news for consumers. So the question arises, why? Why would the US export oil it already has only to import more from somewhere else? Make it make sense. We'll get to the core reason in the second half of this video, but to fully understand it, we first need to explore the paradox of the American oil ecosystem. As always, please be sure to hit that like and subscribe button down below. Alright, let's start. Starting with the fact that America's daily oil output is higher than that of major oil-producing countries. You probably know, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Russia. But the US only ranks 11th when it comes to the actual size of oil reserves. According to recent data, US holds roughly 36.5 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. Now, I know billions sounds like a lot, but for comparison, the country leading in terms of oil reserves, Venezuela, has around 300.28 billion barrels of oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran also possess oil reserves significantly larger than the US. Then, how exactly does the US manage to produce so much oil despite its relatively modest reserves? Well, it all comes down to America's unique approach to oil production and strategic policies on how and when to tap into its resources. You see, countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar aren't interested in pumping out as much oil as they possibly can every single day. Instead, they are strategic about it. They carefully control their production to avoid flooding the market with too much oil, which would crash global oil prices. After all, their economies rely heavily on selling oil. So keeping prices stable and high matters a lot to them. There's no better way for me to explain it in words, so I will explain it using my favorite thing in the world, charts. Here you can see Saudi Arabia's GDP and crude oil prices. Here you're seeing Saudi Arabia's GDP alongside global oil prices. Notice how closely they're connected. Whenever oil prices rise, Saudi Arabia's economy thrives. When prices fall, their economy suffers. This creates a huge vulnerability. Countries like Saudi Arabia heavily depend on oil revenue, yet they can't fully control global oil prices, simply because the oil market is enormous, driven by countless buyers and sellers. For example, if a country like Iran suddenly pumps extra oil into the market to fund a war or solve an economic crisis, the increased supply pushes prices down sharply. That price drop then directly hurts other oil-dependent countries, like Saudi Arabia, even though they had nothing to do with the extra supply. That's exactly why, back in the 1990s, Saudi Arabia introduced a strategy that surprised everyone, a way to carefully manage their daily oil production, stabilizing prices, and protecting their economy. Now, we'll talk more about this later in the video, but for now, just remember that oil-exporting countries like Saudi Arabia must be very careful in controlling their daily output to maintain stable prices. The US, on the other hand, doesn't care much about keeping oil prices high. In fact, the US prefers to keep them as low as possible. That's because we are dependent on oil too, but in the opposite sense of Saudi Arabia. We love using oil, and that means We are a buyer, so we want the prices to be low. That's why America aggressively taps into its oil reserves, producing as much as it possibly can. The more oil available in the market, the lower the price. This approach, combined with major technological advancement in oil extraction, has allowed the US to become the world's largest oil producer, despite having significantly smaller reserves than many other oil-rich nations. You see, back in the early 1900s, both the US and the world as a whole didn't really depend much on oil, because energy sources like coal still dominated everyday life. Oil was abundant, but there wasn't much urgency to use it. But then, as World War I approached, things began to change very quickly. It turned out that oil had some unique benefits that coal simply couldn't match. Unlike coal, oil was easy to transport, simple to store, and could power not just ships and factories, but vehicles on the land and airplanes in the sky. In other words, petroleum was becoming a new kind of strategic weapon, a critical military resource that countries realized they needed. This new reality became obvious to the US Navy very quickly. They realized their ships would be faster, more efficient, and strategically more powerful if they were powered by oil rather than coal. To secure this advantage, the Navy urgently began making sure it had steady access to foreign oil, especially from Mexico or the Caribbean countries, which had large reserves and were geographically close enough to supply America efficiently. But once World War I started, German submarines called U-boats began attacking and sinking ships carrying oil across the Atlantic. Suddenly, America's dependence on foreign oil became a very huge vulnerability and pushed the US government into emergency action for greater domestic oil production. The government poured massive amounts of money, manpower, and scientific research into discovering and extracting oil at home. This led to the establishment of the US Bureau of Mines in 1910. An agency specifically dedicated to finding new ways to extract oil, refine it efficiently, and transport it safely over long distances, especially during wartime. Thanks to these developments, states like Texas, Oklahoma, and California soon became massive centers of oil production, rapidly transforming the US into the world's most dominant petroleum producer. In 1914, America was responsible for a staggering 70% of the world's oil production. In fact, during the First World War alone, US oil output increased by about 50%, surging beyond 500 million barrels a year by the end of the war. This incredible expansion helped power not only American military efforts, but also supported America's allies, who desperately needed reliable sources of oil. Around the same time, major European powers like Britain, France, and the Netherlands also realized that oil was becoming the energy source of the future. These countries began establishing major international oil companies such as Shell and British Petroleum to secure and develop oil reserves globally. Meanwhile, back home, the United States was working on something that would dramatically increase the nation's demand for oil. On July 7, 1919, a U.S. military convoy set out from Washington, D.C., heading across the country to San Francisco. Among the personnel involved was a young Army officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become president. Their mission was to closely inspect America's road system and transportation infrastructure by driving directly across the nation. What they saw was completely unexpected and disturbing. The roads were mostly dirt, filled with potholes, uneven terrain, and turned muddy after the rain. Conditions were so poor that, at times, the convoy managed an average speed of just 5 miles per hour, making the cross-country trip incredibly slow and frustrating. This experience had profound impact on Eisenhower. He quickly understood that good roads weren't simply about convenience, they were a crucial national security issue. Decades later, when Eisenhower became president in the 1950s, he remembered the trip, and he took action on it. In 1956, he signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which created the Interstate Highway System, a modern nationwide network of high-quality roads connecting major cities, towns, and military installations across America. A decision that would dramatically transform American life. Highways enabled efficient movement of goods, boosted interstate commerce, and encouraged millions of more Americans to buy and regularly drive automobiles. But even during those prosperous years of the mid-20th century, some policymakers in Washington anticipated a problem. They worried America's own oil fields might eventually fall short of rapidly growing demand. Luckily, around the same time, foreign oil, especially from the Middle East, started looking like an attractive alternative because it was abundant and cheaper. The Middle East had just found itself sitting on massive oil reserves. Saudi Arabia quickly ramped up production and became a major player in the global oil market. Not only did the region have enormous reserves, but it could also extract and refine oil at significantly lower costs. smart investments and an ideal geographic location further boosted Saudi Arabia's competitive advantage. But simply having cheap, plentiful oil wasn't enough. They also needed a big market. Global industrialization, especially in the US, provided exactly that. Demand for oil soared as factories multiplied and millions of cars hit American roads. Middle Eastern countries were perfectly placed to meet this increasing global thirst for oil. US policymakers actually debated whether deliberately importing more oil might conserve America's own reserves for the future. But ultimately, they rejected the idea of heavy reliance on foreign crude. In 1957, a government committee warned that increasing imports would discourage domestic drilling, weakening national security. If foreign supply was ever disrupted, the US would be vulnerable, a prediction that would come true in the 1970s. But at the time, President Eisenhower imposed import quotas in 1959, strictly limiting foreign oil to protect domestic producers. The goal was to ensure the US always had a healthy oil industry and ample capacity in case of emergencies. America largely remained self-sufficient into the early 1960s. But by the late 1960s, US oil fields, especially in Texas, began reaching their peak. In 1970, domestic oil production hit an all-time high of about 9.6 million barrels per day. After this point, production started to decline, but the demand still kept touching new highs. Cars consumed more gasoline, and the economy kept growing. Soon, importing oil became necessary just to keep everything running. Facing fuel shortages, President Nixon lifted Eisenhower's import quotas in 1973, just as US oil imports reached roughly 30% of total consumption. From that point on, the US started becoming heavily dependent on oil from overseas, a situation that made many policymakers increasingly uncomfortable. It quickly became clear how risky America's reliance on foreign oil could be. In October of 1973, a war broke out in the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War. And when the United States gave military aid to Israel, Arab oil exporters retaliated. They placed an embargo on oil shipments to America, abruptly choking off supplies. Practically overnight, the flow of Middle Eastern crude into US ports dropped drastically. This triggered widespread panic. Global oil prices soared, first doubling and then quadrupling within just a few months. Across America, drivers faced endless lines at gas stations and empty fuel pumps. Gasoline was suddenly scarce and had to be rationed. At the moment, drastic steps had to be taken. One major move was the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975. Under this program, hundreds of millions of barrels of oil would be stored in massive underground salt caverns. This strategic stockpile provided America with an emergency supply of oil, ready to be released whenever necessary. Today, it's the largest publicly known emergency oil supply in the world, stored in massive underground tanks in Louisiana and Texas, capable of holding up to 714 million barrels. Since the Israel-Iran conflict started, crude oil prices have jumped 10%. And with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, crude oil prices are likely to jump multifold and an all-out war. Alongside creating strategic oil reserves, the US government also tried to lower overall oil demand. For instance, it introduced a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour on highways to conserve fuel. The government also set federal fuel economy standards for the first time, requiring new vehicles to use gasoline more efficiently. Additionally, in 1974, America teamed up with other oil-importing countries to form the International Energy Agency, aiming for better cooperation in managing global oil supplies and crises more effectively. Just 1 month after Arab oil exports stopped, the US government approved construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. Finished in 1977, this pipeline significantly increased domestic oil production by transporting crude from Alaska's North Slope to ports in the south. At the same time, the government encouraged further oil exploration and drilling efforts, both offshore, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, and onshore across various states. Despite these measures, America's dependence on foreign oil continued to grow throughout the 70s. Soon enough, another crisis hit. In 1979, revolution erupted in Iran, which was a major global oil producer at the time. The Iranian government collapsed, and it took with it millions of barrels of oil that were taken off the global markets. Almost overnight, Iran's exports plunged, triggering panic and doubling of oil prices within just a few months. The impact hit the US hard too. Just like the 1973 gas crisis, gas stations struggled to keep enough fuel on hand, leading to endless queues and rationing. Experiencing two shocks within a single decade clearly revealed the country's vulnerability. As long as the US relied heavily on foreign oil, events happening far away, whether revolutions, wars, or political turmoil, could instantly disrupt daily life at home, spike gas prices, and unsettle the entire economy. After these repeated shocks, the US realized it had to cut its dependence on foreign oil, or risk economic turmoil whenever conflicts erupted abroad. Completely cutting dependence on foreign oil was unrealistic. It would take decades. As we'll soon explain why, the only practical alternative was to manage and contain conflicts abroad. This is exactly why, in January of 1980, President Jimmy Carter permanently changed US policy. He declared that Persian Gulf oil was vital to American national interests. President Carter warned that any attempt by a hostile power to seize control of the Gulf region would be met with military force. The statement became known as the Carter Doctrine, a direct response to two major crises of the late 1970s. From that point on, the US maintained a strong military presence in the Persian Gulf. It built bases, forged security partnerships with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, and stationed warships to protect oil shipping lanes. The US Navy became, in effect, a guardian of global oil transport, ensuring that tankers could transit the Strait of Hormuz and other choke points that carry the lifeblood of the world economy. This explains why, right now, two American carrier strike groups, led by the USS Nimitz and the USS Carl Vinson, are positioned in the Arabian Sea, giving Central Command access to more than 120 carrier-based fighters. Inside the Gulf, the Fifth Fleet operates 14 patrol and mine countermeasure ships stationed permanently in the region, plus the 4 deployed USS Canberra for escort duties. Additionally, there are dozens of advanced aircraft like F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning II fighters, and KC-10 refueling tankers stationed in the region, ready to respond if Iran escalates tensions further. On top of that, America's allies also contribute significant military resources. For example, the UK's Type 23 frigate HMS Lancaster is permanently based in Bahrain, while France operates hundreds of troops and Rafale fighter jets from its bases at Camp de la Paix and Al Dhafra. The combined maritime forces, an allegiance of 46 nations, including France, Britain, Italy, Japan, and Australia, regularly deploys destroyers and patrol vessels under Task Force Sentinel, specifically tasked with escorting tankers safely through Hormuz. All this immense military effort exists for one purpose: to keep oil flowing consistently day and night. After the Carter Doctrine in the late 1970s, the following decade turned out to favor America, at least for a short period. Thanks to combined efforts in conservation and finding new oil sources, US oil imports actually declined temporarily. High oil prices had motivated Americans to use less fuel. People drove smaller, more efficient cars and lowered their thermostats. As a result, American oil consumption either stayed steady or slightly dropped in the early 1980s. At the same time, oil supplies from outside of OPEC increased significantly. Major new oil fields came into production in Alaska's North Slope, and the North Sea off the coast of the UK and Norway, and in Mexico. By 1982, these developments had helped reduce US dependency on imported oil by about 28%, down from nearly half in the late 1970s. As non-OPEC countries boosted their output, OPEC's control over the global oil market weakened considerably. By 1986, there was an oversupply of oil worldwide, causing oil prices to collapse dramatically, falling below $15 a barrel, a far cry from the panic-level prices of earlier. Although the low oil prices in the late 1980s were a relief for American consumers, they also created complacency. With gasoline becoming cheap and abundant once again, America's appetite for oil grew once more. In the booming economy of the 1990s, large, fuel-inefficient vehicles like SUVs and pickup trucks became highly popular. Americans bought these bigger vehicles in large numbers, and US oil consumption steadily climbed. By 1990, America was again importing about half of the oil it consumed, and the timing couldn't have been worse. That August, another crisis in the Middle East showed the US just how risky its dependence on foreign oil had become. Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, quickly capturing its valuable oil fields and openly threatening that Saudi Arabia was next. In response, President George H.W. Bush declared that Iraq's aggression poses an economic threat to the United States, which now imports half its oil. He also made it clear that defending Saudi Arabia's independence was a vital U.S. interest. To counter this threat, the U.S. led an international coalition in the Gulf War. Following through on the Carter Doctrine, the U.S. showed it was willing to use military force to secure global oil supplies. During this conflict, the U.S. government tapped into its Strategic Petroleum Reserve for the first time. releasing about 34 million barrels of oil to stabilize the market. Through the 1990s and the early 2000s, US oil demand kept rising steadily. By 2005, it reached an all-time high of 20.8 million barrels per day. At that point, America imported about 60% of its oil, the highest dependency ever recorded. Much of this oil came from neighbors like Canada and Mexico, along with OPEC nations including Venezuela, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. But the sheer scale of this dependency became a major political issue. In 2006, President George W. Bush famously said, "America is addicted to oil," and emphasized the urgent need to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, especially those from unstable or hostile countries. Around this period, global factors started shaking up oil markets once again. Rapid economic growth in China and India sharply boosted worldwide oil demand, pushing prices higher. At the same time, production in older oil regions was slowing down or stalling. From 2005 to 2008, oil prices steadily climbed, reaching a record high of $147 per barrel in the summer of 2008. Americans felt the pain directly as gasoline soared above $4 per gallon nationwide. The public and politicians alike demanded solutions. Many argued America could drill its way out of this crisis, making "drill, baby, drill" a popular slogan for those urging expanded domestic oil production. However, before these new drilling plans could even begin, another disaster struck. In late 2008, the global financial system collapsed and drastically cut energy demand. Oil prices quickly dropped, falling from a record high of $147 per barrel down to under $40 by early 2009, giving Americans temporary relief at gas pumps. Yet, without people realizing it, a major upgrade was quietly happening in America's oil industry. Years of technological experiments were finally paying off, changing U.S. energy in a big way. In states like Texas and North Dakota, companies started using two older methods together: horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking. Horizontal drilling starts by drilling straight down into the earth like traditional oil wells, but once the drill reaches a certain depth, it gradually curves and continues sideways through oil-rich rock formations. This allows companies to reach oil deposits spread horizontally underground, covering much larger areas with fewer wells. In fracking, after the well is drilled, a mixture of water, sand, and certain chemicals is pumped down into the well under very high pressure. This intense pressure creates tiny cracks or fractures in the underground rock. Once the pressure is released, these tiny cracks are held open by grains of sand, allowing trapped oil and natural gas to flow freely to the surface. Around 2009, U.S. oil production, which had been declining since 1970, suddenly began to rise again. And it kept rising year after year, and it didn't stop. 2009 was the beginning of the shale boom, also known as America's new oil renaissance. By 2015, U.S. oil production had roughly doubled from its low point in 2008, reaching levels not seen for decades. In fact, by 2018, America had surpassed both Saudi Arabia and Russia, once again becoming the world's largest crude oil producer. This incredible turnaround happened because technology allowed companies to extract from oil fields previously thought to be exhausted or unreachable. Regions like the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico and the Bakken Formation in North Dakota led the way, contributing millions of barrels of oil per day. This big jump in U.S. production changed America's oil import situation significantly. Throughout the 2010s, oil imports dropped sharply. Petroleum imports fell to their lowest level since the 1980s and kept declining steadily. By 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the U.S. became a net exporter of petroleum for the first time in recent history, a turnaround few would have imagined possible just 10 years earlier. When looking at crude oil alone, America still imported more than it exported, but the difference shrank massively. As of 2023, U.S. crude oil production averaged around 12.9 million barrels per day, close to an all-time high. Crude imports averaged around 6.5 million barrels per day, while exports reached about 4.1 million barrels. This meant net crude imports were roughly 2.4 million barrels per day, far lower than in previous decades. In short, America now produces most of the oil it needs domestically, relying on imports for just a small portion. But there's a reason the US can't completely stop importing oil. And this brings us to the core point of this video. It comes down to two critical factors: oil quality and the practical problems that follow, because, as it turns out, not all crude oil is made the same. And energy independence is not as simple as just drilling and using it. You see, crude oil comes in many grades and varieties. It's mainly differentiated by two characteristics: density and sulfur content. If you snoop around, you'll find that crude is described as light or heavy, sweet or sour. Light oil is thin, it flows easily, and yields a lot of high-value fuels like gasoline when refined. Heavy oil is thick and viscous, with more impurities. It's tougher to refine but can yield other products like diesel, and it often sells for less. Sweet crudes have low sulfur, which is easier on refineries and the environment, whereas sour crude contains more sulfur and requires extra processing to remove it. The oil America now produces from shale is mostly light and sweet. Geologists measure oil density with something called API gravity. Higher numbers indicate lighter oil. Much of the shale oil from Texas and North Dakota has very high API gravity, often above 40 or even 45, meaning it's quite thin and easy to refine. But the oil traditionally imported by the US from places like Canada's oil sands, Venezuela's Orinoco Belt, or the Middle East is generally heavy and sour, typically with an API gravity under 30. This imported oil is essentially the opposite of the light shale oil coming from fields like the Permian Basin. At first, this might not make much sense, but hear me out. Most US oil refineries, in particular those on the Gulf Coast and in the Midwest, are designed specifically to handle heavy, sour crude. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, global oil production was shifting towards heavier grades. So US refiners invested billions upon billions in specialized equipment such as cockers, crackers, and desulfurization units. These are meant to process heavier, lower quality oil into high-value products. By one estimate, nearly 70% of US refining capability is optimized for heavier grades. These refineries can process light oil as well, but they aren't optimized for it. Their elaborate upgrading unit actually performs best when fed thicker, lower quality crude that needs a lot of processing. If you give them only ultra-light oil, those expensive units sit underutilized, and the refinery produces more gasoline than the market might absorb and less of other needed fuels. So when US shale fields began producing large amounts of light, sweet oil, it created a mismatch between the type of oil being pumped and what refineries were built to handle. American refiners still need heavier crude to mix with the lighter oil and keep their production balanced. And since heavy crude was the easiest to buy abroad, particularly from Canada, imports remained necessary. By the 2010s, Canada has become America's largest single source of imported oil. Canada's oil sands produce an extremely thick, heavy crude. So thick, in fact, it usually needs to be mixed with lighter oils just to flow through the pipelines. US Gulf Coast refineries, however, are perfectly set up to handle this kind of crude. In 2022 alone, about 69% of US oil imports were heavy grades, and Canada provided roughly 61% of these imports. By the mid-2020s, nearly 90% of all oil imported into the US was heavier than typical shale oil produced domestically in places like Texas. Imported heavy oil and domestic shale oil aren't directly interchangeable. They complement each other in refining. This helps refineries run efficiently, producing more balanced fuel outputs and earning better profits, since heavy oil is often cheaper. It's not about needing more oil overall, it's about getting the right kind of oil. Also, if the US had decided to modify its refineries to process only the light, sweet oil it now produces, it would have faced huge costs and major delays. Upgrading a refinery to handle a completely different type of oil is an expensive, multi-billion-dollar effort, and it might take decades to see a return on such an investment, if ever. Refineries would essentially be gambling that heavy oil supplies would disappear and that abundant shale production would remain steady for decades. And since heavy oil is still widely available, particularly from Canada, and given that the US shale production can be unpredictable, refiners prefer blending heavy and light crude. As long as heavy crude remains plentiful and affordable, it's always cheaper and easier for the US to keep importing it. Now, the reason America imports heavy crude makes sense, right? But then why does it export oil at the same time? Well, the shale boom created a different issue: too much light oil. You see, from 1975 to 2015, US law prohibited most crude oil exports, a rule set during the oil crisis of the 1970s to protect the domestic supply. But by 2014 to 2015, the country produced more light crude oil than US refineries could efficiently process. Without the ability to export, producers would need to cut back their output. After some pretty intense debate, Congress lifted the export ban in December of 2015. Almost immediately, American shipments of light crude oil started heading overseas from Texas ports to markets like Europe and Asia. Today, the US imports roughly 6 million barrels per day of mostly heavy oil, while simultaneously exporting several millions per day of lighter shale oil. And beyond just the chemistry of the crude oil, there's another down-to-earth reason the US still imports oil: geography and logistics. Sometimes crude oil is not in the right place at the right time. America's oil infrastructure, pipelines, terminals, storage tanks, and ports, was built decades ago based on historical oil flows. However, the system was designed to move imported oil inland from coastal ports or to move domestic oil from traditional fields like those in Alaska or West Texas to other parts of the country. But the shale boom changed this pattern overnight, adding huge new volumes of oil from unexpected places like North Dakota and new fields in West Texas. Pipelines and rail infrastructure have expanded to accommodate the shift, but bottlenecks still remain. Take the US East Coast, for example. States like New York and Pennsylvania use a lot of refined fuel, but there's relatively little oil production and limited refining capacity. Ideally, they could simply get oil or refined fuels from Texas or the Gulf Coast. But the pipelines running from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast are mostly used for refined fuels and are often full. Shipping oil by sea within the US faces another barrier: the Jones Act. This law requires that domestic cargo travel on US-flagged ships, which are significantly more expensive. Because of this, it can actually be cheaper for East Coast refineries to import oil by tanker from places like West Africa or the Middle East, rather than buying it from Texas or the Gulf Coast. Similarly, at times it's more economical to import gasoline or diesel from Europe than to source it domestically. These logistical and regional challenges explain why certain parts of America still rely partly on foreign imports, even though the country overall produces nearly enough oil domestically. And the key point here is that energy infrastructure doesn't change overnight. Building new pipelines or rerouting supply chains can take years in permitting, construction, and billions of dollars. If we decide let's only use US oil everywhere, we'd need a massive replumbing of the system. New pipelines to send West Coast crude to the East Coast, new refining setups in different regions, etc. I mean, this is theoretically doable, but extremely slow and hella expensive. Another infrastructure consideration is storage and spare capacity. The US maintains these strategic petroleum reserves for emergencies, but outside of that, companies only keep so much oil in storage. If the US tried to completely shut off imports, it would have to rely solely on domestic production plus existing stocks. Any hiccup, say a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico that temporarily halts offshore oil output or damages refineries, could lead to shortages in some areas. So you see how importing a couple of millions of barrels helps keep everything in check. For instance, in 2019, an attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities temporarily knocked out a large part of the global supply. The US didn't directly need Saudi oil at that time, but when global prices surged, American refineries turned to alternative imports as a precaution. Similarly, in mid-2021, a cyber attack shut down the Colonial Pipeline, which moves refined fuel from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast. During this disruption, East Coast refineries imported additional gasoline from Europe until the pipeline was restored. Both events highlight how import flexibility keeps the system stable during unexpected crisis. Taking this all into account, it becomes clear why just using your own oil isn't really a practical option for the US. Oil isn't a simple commodity. It's part of a complex global network involving many countries, companies, and billions of dollars in infrastructure. The American energy system evolved to combine domestic strength with global integration. As of 2025, the US doesn't have to rely on imported oil, but it chooses to do so, because doing so makes economic sense. America benefits from having plenty of domestic oil for security and still having access to global supplies. Policymakers, at least for now, aim to maintain that careful balance.